Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, The Nuts and Bolts of Backbone Functions, organized by NCSS, the Tamarack Institute, as well as the Social Service Institute. For those of you who have been joining us in this webinar series, thank you very much for your support. Just a recap, this is a 4-part webinar series, and this is the third webinar. We started off by going into how to start a collective impact project, and then follow up by the second webinar where we talk about this whole idea of collaborative leadership. And today we are going to focus on a very important aspect of collective impact, which is the backbone function, and really going to the nuts and bolts of it. So I'm very happy that we have many of you who is coming back to follow through with this whole series, and I hope that you are benefiting from what we have covered so far. So I would like to introduce the first speaker for today's webinar. And for some of you, you would have known Lise. Lise is the co-CEO of Tamarack Institute, where she's leading the Tamarack Learning Center. And Lise is well known for her thought leadership on collective impact and is the author of several popular and academic papers on the topic. She's a co-catalyst partner with the Collective Impact Forum, and in 2018, led a collective impact capacity building strategy with the Ontario Trinum Foundation. Lise is passionate about the power and potential of communities getting to impact on complex issues. And prior to her current role at Tamarack, Lise led the Vibrant Communities Canada team and assisted place-based collaborative tables develop their frameworks of change and supported and guided their projects from idea to impact. So without further ado, I will invite Lise to come on board the platform and give us a presentation today. Lise.
Thanks so much, Weepeng, and hello everybody in our virtual big room here. Really happy to be with you again today and to talk about one of my favorite things, which is both collective impact and backbone functions and the nuts and bolts of it. So hopefully by the end of the webinar, you'll learn some new things. At any time a question rises up for you, please put it into the chat box. And at the end of the webinar, we're going to address some of your questions. And if we don't get to all the questions that you have, we will, in our post-webinar email, we'll answer the questions or we'll bring them to the final webinar in the series, which is really trying to answer some of the questions that were raised during all three webinars, all three of these first three webinars. So for today, we're going to talk about backbone functions. There will be some time where we're going to talk about the resources that are required for backbone functions. We're going to talk about how they need to be supported, what some of the key skills are that you want to look for when you're recruiting your backbone table leaders, and also how to evaluate backbone functions. So those are some of the topics that we'll cover during the course of the webinar, but there'll be a bit more as well. So the way we want to ground ourselves is to really think about, okay, so what is collective impact? And I'm just going to spend a minute talking about the 5 core functions of collective impact, because they really do tie into the backbone. And as you'll notice on this slide, one of the core functions is that we have a backbone. So collective impact, what in the design of the framework of collective impact, one of the things that John Kenya and Mark Kramer really identified was the need for a group to steward this work forward. And so they called it backbone support. And this meant that for some people, the collective work moved from the side of the desk to the middle of the desk, or at least had a more prominent role in the desk. And so it's about the backbone functions are really about managing the collective impact work. Sometimes there's a dedicated staff, but what we've learned in the unfolding of collective impact efforts across Canada, the United States, and in other places, each community and each collective impact initiative looks slightly different. So in some cases, there are cases where the collective impact work is done totally by volunteers in the backbone functions. In other cases, there's a staff team that supports it. So when we think at Tamarack about the collective impact structure, we think about it as being a structure in 2 parts. Some people will think of the backbone as only the staffing component. We don't at Tamarack. We think about the backbone as both the leadership table and the staff, if there are staff supporting the backbone. And it's that combination of those two that really makes up the backbone functions or the backbone entity within the collective impact initiative. And then on the other side of the table is this kind of community ecosystem. And I'll show you some visuals about this, but the community ecosystem that could be composed of action teams, it could be other organizations in the community that are working on issues that are related to the common agenda that you're hoping to solve. There's all different ways that that ecosystem can express itself. And so we'll talk about the backbone, and we're going to talk about the community ecosystem during this webinar today. So if we go to the next slide, what we've done on this slide is give you a little bit more definition in terms of some of the key roles that we see within a collective impact structure. So often in collective impact structures, there's usually one organization or a couple of organizations that are called conveners. And they usually are the first set of people that say, hey, here's an issue that we want to deal with, whether it's, poverty reduction or senior support or mental health and well-being or youth. So they convene a conversation or they convene people to be involved in the collective impact effort. Sometimes the convener also plays the role of a fiscal sponsor, and a fiscal sponsor holds the money on behalf of the whole collective. And so they're often a nonprofit organization, but they don't necessarily always have to be a nonprofit. It could be a government department. It could be a community foundation. We'll hear a little bit later from Joyce how she's played that role for some of their collective impact work. So it really depends on, in every community or in every collective impact initiative, who is the right kind of convener, fiscal sponsor. Then there's a leadership table. Typically, leadership tables are 10 to 15 individuals, but they can be as large as 40 individuals or 50 individuals. It really depends on, the size and scope of the work that you're doing. The leadership table really is the stewards of the collective impact work. And then there's a collective impact staff team. So that is the piece that makes up the backbone functions. The community ecosystem is comprised of working groups or action tables or action teams. It doesn't matter what you call them, but they're doing the work, driving the strategies forward in the community. And there might be a larger community network of organizations or other partners or churches or sports teams that you might bring into the collective work because they can be connected in some kind of way. So that's the kind of core role. The functions of a backbone. So there are 6 functions of a backbone, and they align really nicely with the core components of the collective impact framework. So the backbone, the leadership table, the staff, the convener, and the fiscal agent, they guide the vision and strategy, and they actually set it. So they'll build the common agenda, but then as the common agenda is rolling out and you have these action teams moving forward, the leadership table and the backbone team really kind of looks at, okay, so are these working groups, are these action teams aligned with what our vision and strategy is? They support the aligned activities. They're the ones who take the lead in shared measurement. In terms of building public will, so the folks in the backbone really look at, okay, so if we're moving this collective impact effort forward, is our community buying in? And who are the people that we need to be talking to? So they're really involved in continuous communications and community engagement. If there are policy changes that need to happen, they're the ones who look for opportunities to advance policy shifts and they're also the group that mobilizes funding. So they have a lot of things that they have to do. And that's why you need a backbone that is really made up of people that have some resources, have some skills, have some influence, and have some networks. So there are some, as collective impact was unfolding in its early days, the folks at FSG and the Collective Impact Forum surveyed 6 different backbone leaders in Pennsylvania. And what they found was, these leaders said, hey, we're encountering this all the time, these kind of common misconceptions. And these common perceptions are ones that we have to kind of always pay attention to, particularly if we're sitting or we're involved in a collective impact backbone. One is that the backbone organization or the backbone is just setting the whole agenda, that there's a single organization that's setting the whole agenda. It really should be a shared agenda, that the backbone drives all the solutions, that it receives all the funding. The best scenario is when money comes into the collective impact effort and then flows out to help the work advance. If one organization receives all the funding and then spends all the funding, the rest of the people around the collective impact table often aren't very happy and they don't know why they're sitting there. So it's really thinking about how do we flow resources appropriately, and that this work is work that is different from how we might run a nonprofit organization, because this is about shared and collective work. It's not only about a single organization, it's about a group of organizations and business leaders, government. So it's about this diverse group coming together and saying, hey, there's a opportunity or a problem that we're trying to solve in our community. And we're really going to benefit from the wisdom of everybody that's involved in the backbone functions. So on the next slide, we go into a little bit about what you're looking for when you're recruiting backbone, some of the backbone leadership, right? And this again comes from that research that the folks at FSG did when they talked to 6 backbone leaders, and they said, oh, what are some of the things that you bring to the table or that you look for when you're recruiting kind of key strategic leaders? And they said, we're looking for people that have a good vision, a vision for what can shift in the community, but also a vision about a better community. So we're all often, collective impact efforts are tackling an issue. It might be, social isolation and loneliness, or mental health and addictions. And often when we're tackling this more complex issue, you want people who can see better outcomes for the community, that have that vision that the folks around the backbone table should share. They have to also be results oriented, though, because it's not just about talking, it's about improving outcomes in the community. You want backbone members who are collaborative, who have a wide networks that they bring in, that they can potentially bring into the collective work, and that are also relationship builders. Because often around collective impact tables, you have people that are coming around the table from different sectors. So you might have business leaders, you might have folks that work in government, you might have folks that work in the not-for-profit sector, work in philanthropy, work in the faith communities. And so you want to build relationships across these different sectors as you're building your backbone. You need folks that are focused on the end result, but adaptive in the process, that have the ability to be communicators, that have some political savvy, right? So that they kind of can understand what's happening in this community, who are the leaders in this community I should be talking to, and then how do we navigate some of that kind of stuff that happens in community, some of the politics that happens in communities. And, it's also really important that backbone leaders are humble in the work that they're doing, and recognize that it's about kind of shared leadership or collective leadership in some ways. And so those are things that you want to look for in backbone leaders. Here's an example of a collective impact effort that existed in Waterloo, in the Waterloo region. And this is what they use to recruit members to their backbone team. So rather than say, we want members who are, leaders in the community, they said, here are the skill sets that we're looking for. And I love this because it kind of says, we're really looking for people that bring these skills to our table. So not only are we looking for people with spheres of influence and positions of influence, or who might represent different sectors or different perspectives. We're also looking for people that can translate what the community is about, that have, a strategic way of looking at this work, that are practical, might be collaborative leaders, etc. So on the next slide, what we have for you, if we can just keep bringing this whole slide together, perfect. So this is an example of a backbone structure. So as you know, I kind of, I think there's one more click forward. Yeah, there we go. So on the one side, we have a steering committee or a leadership table. They're the same thing. And then we have our backbone kind of staffing team. And it's really the steering committee, the leadership table, and the backbone staffing team, the strategic guidance and support that makes up the backbone function. I was saying to Joyce earlier, before you all joined us on the call, that there are many collective impact efforts that only think about the staffing team as the backbone function, and sometimes they do that at their peril. I like to think about the backbone function as encompassing both the steering committee or the leadership table and the staffing team, because then you have more resources that you're able to draw from in terms of helping to steward this work forward. Because there are lots of people that would be sitting around your leadership table or your steering committee that have access to resources than a small staffing team might have. And it's about, really looking at what can we draw in to help support this work and move it forward. And then on the other side is this community ecosystem of partners. And that's the working groups or the action teams. They're connected into this work. And you can see the other bubbles in this larger ecosystem. Sometimes your working groups might be individuals in the community, they might be organizations, they might be, faith leaders, that kind of thing. But then there might be some other organizations that aren't sitting at the working group or action team table. And if you can map out who is in the community doing similar work, or work that is in parallel, or work that could be somehow connected to your collective impact work, just imagine the power of all of that in terms of driving the work forward and being aware not only of what the working groups are doing, but also aware of the whole eco-cycle gives the collective impact work a whole lot of power, a whole lot of ways to kind of think about, yes, we have a working group that's working on this, but this organization over here, we might draw into, or we might leverage some of the skills and resources that they have. So now we're going to talk about the two parts of a collective impact backbone or organizing structure in a little bit more detail. So this is, so at Tamarack, we recently launched an initiative called Communities Building Youth Futures. And so if you see CBYF, that's what that stands for, CBYF. And so this is the example that we're drawing from. So in the Communities Building Youth Futures, it's a network of 13 leadership tables across Canada that are trying to advance youth outcomes. So to make sure that youth successfully complete high school, have good transitions into post-secondary education, into training, or into employment. So it's all about really helping youth make those successful transitions. And so in each community of these 13 communities, there's an organization that acts as the convener. Each of the communities has a different convener. So in one community, it's a pre-existing table that has acted as the convener. In another community, it's an organization. In another community, it's a school board that acts as the convener. And so it's interesting because each of the communities makes a choice about who that convener is, and it's appropriate for the work that they're doing. And then they form a leadership table. And around these leadership tables, there are business leaders, there are government leaders, there are voluntary sector leaders. And what's really important is that there are youth leaders around these tables. And so that makes up the leadership table. And then they have a small team of staff that are supporting the work in each of the communities. So in some cases, they might have one staff. And what all of the organizations, all of the communities building youth futures organizations have is they have a youth that's also part of their staff team, because that's an important element in terms of their design. So you can see in this example that that becomes the backbone infrastructure. And so what their main job is to move the vision, the common agenda forward, to monitor, how the community is being engaged, to support the work that's going on, and to support the overall governance function. In terms of the ecosystem, if we go to the next slide, we can share with you what's happening with the Communities Building Youth Futures Initiative. So they have this ecosystem that they're building. So they're in the early stages in forming their common agendas and settling in on them, but already they have formed action teams. And so they have youth advisory councils. And that's one of their action teams, moving the work forward and connecting into youth in the community. And so in the constellation model of governance, which is this design, what's interesting about it is that the action teams are not there forever. They're kind of like stars, right? They burn brightly when there's lots of energy, and then when the energy dissipates, you can, the action team kind of goes away, right? Once their job is done, you don't have to support them anymore. They really are focused on their job. And then once the job is done, you might form another action team, or if there's another priority that comes forward. So we have here 4 action teams, but that's not always the case. So we wouldn't say that a large number of action teams are really the best. I would say anywhere between 3 to 5 or 6 action teams are probably what we see in most collective impact initiatives. So it's usually in that range. To support any more than that, that would take a lot of work. And sometimes we would see things like at the beginning of a collective impact initiative, one action team might be focused on communications, for example, and communicating out about it. But once you've got the word out and the community knows a lot about that collective impact work, then that action team might end its work, and then an evaluation action team might come forward. And so it's interesting to see how different collective impact initiatives use these action teams, use these working groups as a way of seeding part of the work and moving the work forward in communities. So that's kind of the core of an approach when you're thinking about collective impact, thinking about, this backbone stewardship role that we have, and then this community ecosystem. But there's also a lot of other roles that people can play in communities to support collective impact work. So we always like to say that we're only limited by our imaginations, right? So sometimes someone will say to you, yeah, I don't really have enough time to join your leadership table or your action teams, but I really do think that this is important work. Well, could they become a champion of your work? Could they talk about it with their colleagues and their community members? So that's a role that you might invite people to. There are other groups in the community that might be able to provide you with data to really say, okay, we can help you with the evaluation components, or we can help you with research and data. So in Hamilton, when I was the director of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, we really wanted to launch our evaluation plan. And what we did was we brought together a group of about 10 people in the community who already looked at data related to poverty in our community. And they became a little bit of an action team, but they also shared their data with us. And what was really good about that was that we didn't then have to collect the data. So we were leveraging resources that already existed in the community. There are partners that can invest in the work. They don't necessarily have to be part of the backbone structure, but they can be investors of the work. There are people that you might be able to bring around this work who can be advocates to levels of government or be advocates to government. There are people that you might engage in some way and they can bring in some community knowledge or linkages, or they can help you with your marketing and media campaigns. And so these folks don't necessarily have to sit at the backbone table, but or at the leadership table, but they could. Or if sometimes people can say, well, I'm really supportive of the work, but I don't have time to come to all the meetings. You still want to engage them. And so you really want to engage them in ways that can be purposeful for the work. There might be some other ideas that you have in terms of additional roles in collective impact. And if you want to put them into the chat box, that would be great. I can see that there are some questions that are appearing in the chat box as well. I'll go through a little bit more and then we'll come back at those questions. They're popping up as I'm presenting. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the backbone convener role and how we've seen it play out across different kinds of backbones that we've seen in collective impact. So sometimes there are backbone conveners who are the funders. And we're going to hear from Joyce later on today, but another funder of some of the homelessness work in Calgary, Alberta is the Calgary Homelessness Foundation. Sometimes they're a nonprofit. They can either be a new nonprofit or an existing nonprofit. Sometimes the convener is a government agency that says, hey, we want to convene the community around this collective impact effort. And so we're going to bring the table together and we're going to provide some of the initial resources. And in some cases with backbones, there might be one or two conveners. So in the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, our conveners were the Community Foundation for the City of Hamilton and the local municipal government. So we in fact had two conveners for the work that was unfolding in Hamilton. So it's really, directly related to which organization is in the right position to convene the table, and do they have the right sphere of influence to be able to bring people around the table. So the folks at FSG again looked at, different ways that conveners and the fiscal agents have been recruited. And they've seen different processes being adopted by different communities. And there's pros and cons to each of the processes. So in some communities, when they're forming a round table and they're looking for a fiscal agent or a convener, they might have an open process and they might say, hey, we want to do this work in youth, and we're going to talk to a whole bunch of organizations in the community who are already working in the youth sphere and ask who wants to apply to be the convener of this youth collective impact table. That can be a way of doing it. The pros are that it's transparent and it builds credibility and it's open to many organizations. Some of the cons are that it takes a lot of time. And sometimes some of the organizations that step up may not necessarily have the right skills, the right leadership. And so you want to look at, if you're going to take an open process, what the pros and cons are. Sometimes it's a semi-open process where there's a short list of organizations and you say, okay, so of this short list, we're going to interview them and then we're going to pick one, right, to convene or to be the fiscal agent for this. And so there are pros and cons in that as well. And then the final one is that it's a predetermined process, right, where someone says, hey, this is such an important issue. We're going to convene people around the table and see where we land. And that's actually what happened initially in Hamilton, was that the Community Foundation and the City of Hamilton, the two leaders of both those organizations, came together and said, we're both really concerned about poverty reduction. We're going to convene. So they predetermined that they were going to be leaders. What we've also been seeing with collective impact initiatives in Canada and the US is that at a certain point in time, typically 3 to 5 to 7 years, the existing convener might say, hey, I've done this for 5 years or 3 years. I want to move on to a different priority in the community. And then they'll go maybe to an open process or a semi-open process. So there aren't typically a collective impact convener might not stay for the whole duration. There might be changes in time. There is also one example in Ottawa, the Ottawa Child and Youth Initiative, where they have conveners and they change every 2 years, which is kind of an interesting model. And what they've said is that we want this initiative to be owned by every member of the leadership table. And so the staff move from one organization to the next organization to the next organization every 2 years. And that organization supports them during that 2-year period by providing office space, by providing financial supports, by providing human resources and some technology supports. And then that staffing team moves to the next organization 2 years later. So that's another model. So, collective impact, it's not a one size fits all model. It's a what works best in our community with the resources that we have, with the leadership that we have around the issue that we're trying to work on. So it's really helpful to know that, there are different models and different approaches there. So if you are a collective impact initiative and you're thinking, okay, so I've been convening and I'm sitting around this table, I'm maybe one of the big funders of this work, and I've been doing it for 4 or 5 years. And so our foundation or our organization wants to move on to other priorities. How do we move from one convener to the next? Here's what we did in Hamilton when we were moving from the Community Foundation to another convener. We built a list of things to consider, right, in looking for a new convener. So we said, is this new convener, do they have an interest in this issue? And does their work align? Does the mission of that organization align? Is there an alignment in the charitable purpose of that organization? Is there a commitment by the leadership of that organization to be involved? Do they have administrative capacity? Is there agreement? So we were looking for a nonprofit organization. Does the board agree that that organization has the resources and the capability to take this work on? Will the CEO or the senior leader participate around the leadership table? Is there capacity? Are they credible? Are they a registered charity? So you can come up with your own list, but I think that this is actually a really good starting point for a list of when you're looking for a convener, what to consider. Now, some of you might say, well, we're looking for a government department to convene. Then you might take some of these and change them, right? You'd still want to look at things like organizational capacity, but you might not necessarily need them to be a registered charity, right? So some of these might not be relevant, but it's a helpful kind of starting point. So I'm going to take you through a couple of things around backbone budgets. And this is, this thing that there's lots of variance in this, right? And so I'm going to give you a US example and a Canadian example, and you can see the differences. And so this is the US example, the first one. And so they're showing the budget over a 3-year time frame. And, in the United States, they really advocate for a lot of resources, and they have a really strong philanthropy focus in the United States, and lots of government investors in collective impact work. And so the budget sizes go anywhere from 300,000 in the first year right up to almost $1 million from years 3. And you can see how the staff grows over time and the work grows over time, but also shifts over time. In Canada, we have less financial resources available to us. And so this is the example from the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. We started with a budget of about $100,000, in the range of 100,000, and slowly grew it. We had multiple investors that we worked on. So we had a director. Our researcher was actually a seconded position from another organization. And so a social planning council gave us the time of a researcher. And so while it wasn't directly in our budget, we did count it as one of our financial resources. And so that was a seconded position. The community foundation, where we were hosted, provided administrative and financial support, and we got support from Tamarack in the early days, and a coach. And all of that gave us this budget of up to 250,000 in our first year, but a lot of it was seconded or in-kind resources that were given to the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. And as we grew our budget size. So in our second year, we reached out to the business leaders that were sitting around our table, and we asked them to each invest $75,000 a piece in the work. We also reached out to the city of Hamilton, and they built a special fund within the community foundation to support the work of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. We continued to get some support from Tamarack in terms of in-kind support. The community foundation continued to give us administrative support, and we were able, with some of the additional resources, to hire a manager of community engagement, and so on. So you can see that in a really interesting way, we were able to grow our budget over time. And we also brought in some additional revenue from other funding pots that were available to us. So, there's not a one size fits all, but you can see how over time this work might be able to leverage some additional resources. That might be true in some communities, might not necessarily be true in all communities, but you can see the types of roles that are being played. What's really interesting in terms of the manager of community engagement for the Hamilton Roundtable, we actually had a person who worked for our federal government, and the federal government had a program where their employees could go work in nonprofit organizations for up to 3 years worth of work, and they would still be able to return back to their government department after that 3 years. And so the federal government paid for 2 years of this employee being working with the Hamilton Roundtable, and we played for the 3rd year. So it was kind of a secondment role as well. So kind of interesting to think about what are the opportunities that are available to you. And so I would say in Singapore, don't be so narrow and think we just have to hire staff. Really look at, can we go to an organization and get their tech to be delivered as an in-kind service? Is there someone that we could bring in from a social media perspective? The next slide is about budgeting. And so here you kind of see what a typical budget might look like for a backbone in the United States and some of the core areas. The next slide after this actually looks at different kinds of funding streams that in Canada and the US and in Singapore, you might have available to you as well. So, who are people that are leading private or corporate foundations? Are there community foundations with some resources? Is there a United Way? Are there local businesses that might give you some resources or some in-kind support, individual donors? Is there an opportunity for government funding? We would say, collective impact efforts are more resilient over the long term when they have diverse funders and diverse sources of funding. There's this really great program in the United States, a collective impact initiative called the Seattle Roadmap Project, they were able to secure a $40 million Reach for the Top grant from the government of the United States to help them do their work. And they've, done some really amazing work. But just imagine that $40 million grant is a 5-year grant. What happens when the $40 million goes away? It's a lot harder to raise that $40 million from a whole lot of sources. And so, sometimes when you have a single investor, it almost becomes a bit of a challenge because replicating that money is really challenging when the money goes away. When you have multiple investors, it's easier if one investor or one funding stream is no longer available. You're more able to leverage other resources. So that's a lot of information about backbones, and I'm going to wrap up, but I have one more slide here. And so this is something that, as you're listening to Joyce, as we're going into the next part of the presentation, here are 2 questions I'd love you to kind of put your answers in the chat box for. So how does your context, your existing relationships, players, leadership, and local capacity affect how you think a backbone or your backbone might operate? And then what else would you like to learn about either collective impact or the roles and functions of backbone? So think about those 2 questions. The final slide that I have in my slide deck is the core ideas. And so these are the 4 things that I want to leave with you. So the collective impact backbone includes the leadership table and the staff, if you have any. That's the backbone. It aligns with, those people that are around the table. So you really have to look at that alignment. So if you're having people sit at the leadership table or you have people at the staff team, there has to be kind of that alignment. There are 6 core functions of a backbone, and then that ecosystem, that community ecosystem is really important, not only from the perspective of trying to understand who the action teams are or what the work of the action teams are, but also navigating all the resources that might be available to help you advance your collective impact work within that broader ecosystem. So there you go. Those are the 4 points that I want to leave you with. And I guess, Wei-Peng, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank you, Lisa. That really is a very informative presentation, and I'm sure the audience are now thinking through what sort of questions do they have, and then for them to post in the chat. And I would encourage you to post your question in the chat so that we can ask your questions during the Q&A. Of course, I don't think we can have time to answer all the questions, but I'll try to collate the similar questions together and ask Lise as well as Joyce later. All right, so without further ado, I would like now to introduce Joyce Teal. She is currently the Deputy CEO of the Community Foundation of Singapore, and she has close to 20 years of experience in the non-profit sector with an interest in corporate community investment as well as philanthropy work. As the DCO of CFS, Joyce oversees the management of philanthropy advisory and grant making, working with donors and non-profit organizations. Her previous work experience in philanthropy and corporate social responsibility was with Salesforce Foundation, as well as the MVPC. And Joyce has personally led in a collective impact project, I believe, as the backbone or the convener. And I believe her experience will be very valuable for all of us. So right now, invite Joyce to come to the platform.
Thanks, Wei-Peng. Just checking in if you can hear me right. Good, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, everyone. Very happy to be here to share my experience, but not entirely my experience. You'll find out more later. It's very hard to follow after Lise because she's like the shifu in all this, and I feel that I'm still learning how to do this well, given that CFS only has about 2 years experience of being a backbone organization for the Singapore Youth Impact Collective. So I'll just quickly share a little bit more about CFS before we get to the details. So as a community foundation in Singapore, CFS focuses on inspiring philanthropy by lowering the barriers of entry for donors in the form of setting up donor advised funds. So we support donors in their giving journey by matching their interests to charitable causes. And that's because we work closely with our charities to understand community needs. We are able to do a very good bridging in terms of what donor wishes to do and also what are the needs that we could support in Singapore society. So a very quick snapshot is that CFS currently holds about 150 funds. Over the last 11 years, we have about 180 million in donations, have given out 100 of those in grants to our charity partners. So just to share very quickly about the Singapore Youth Impact Collective, this really is this is an initiative that CFS's board has sort of generously allowed us to experiment a couple of years back, where we wanted to do more in the area of the collective impact work. So in 2018, CFS with about 6 other partners come together and started the Singapore Youth Impact Collective. It takes CFS more than 6 months really to bring partners together before 2018, and a few more months for us to sort of come to the table to discuss and to understand the agenda, the areas, and the outcomes we hope to achieve. So a response to some of the questions that I saw earlier on, the agenda was not set by CFS. We took the lead in crafting the first draft, and we really worked with the other members in the collective to sort of finalize and to decide the theory of change, as well as the approach and the outcomes that we hope to achieve via this collective. So just very quickly, the collective aims to help disadvantaged youth attain better outcomes in life. And we do so by wanting to work with them in a very holistic manner to help them towards the attainment of qualifications, developing their social emotional skills and assets, and also making sure that they have opportunities or access to employment so that they could test out some of these areas of interest before they embarked on a full career. So the whole idea was really to help marginalized youth in the community find ways that they could do well in and then get a better livelihood so that they could lift themselves out of poverty and have better outcomes in the future. So for the purpose of this, this sort of sharing, right, I felt that because CFS has only done this for 2 years and in the spirit of collective impact work, and due to the interest of time, we are unable to showcase the various organizations in Singapore who have somewhat performed some functions of the backbone organization. So what I've done is that I've gone out and spoke with these various leaders, as well as organizations who have done some form of backbone organization. And in the next 15 minutes, what you actually hear from me will be the sharing of the challenges and learnings that we have faced during the course of doing this, so that you can also learn from us and maybe avoid some of these pitfalls. And the other thing that I wanted to share is that the key lens that I'm using to share this is really that putting you in the perspective that if you're going to start doing this, I want to be a backbone organization. How do I know whether I'm ready for this role? And what are the skill sets that I think I will need in order to play this role well? So the sharing will be really just on this. And I want to thank the various people that I've spoken with to sort of give me the ideas and also allowing me to sort of consolidate their learnings to present it here. So moving into the presentation, one of the questions that sort of, the next slide, please. One of the questions that really stood out at us was really, what is the backbone organization? And this is really in our current context in Singapore, wondering if the backbone organization is an all-powerful convener. Are we a secretariat in the sense of fulfilling all the back-end work, an administrator, or do we play a facilitator? I think the primary difference that a backbone entity is needed to play is really to help in the overall development of the civic structure to have collective impact. If you just think that you're a convener, right, you're really focusing on working with the relevant partners, whether they're practitioners or stakeholders, to come together to build comprehensive and outcome, data-driven outcome around a single purpose along the continuum. So I find that the 4 roles earlier on, actually back to the previous slide, is that these are the 4 roles most common associated with a backbone organization function. And I think none of these are also a primary function. For example, CFS, we may play the role of convener as well as administrator in terms of collecting and administering the funding, like what Liz had shared earlier on. The backbone organization role is really much bigger than that. We bring in the resources, the skills, the influence, and the network, like what she had said, in order to sort of hopefully to engender a better outcome for everybody. So at the next slide, these are some of the key functions, I think, just to iterate what Liz has shared within the local Singapore context that we have faced. So one of the key things that I think is very important for the backbone function is to have the skill in knowing how to, the skills in the knowing how to process the framing of a collective. And this came from one of the leaders who's actually sort of doing this and trying to understand when is the right way to sort of convene it and how do we go about doing it. So we have to understand what are the various stakeholders like, what can they do, what their capacity. We need to be able to see the outcomes for the community, at the same time being able to maintain that vision across time. And especially when there is the daily grind of work, how do we sort of keep the purpose of the collective and at the same time be able to sort of work through it as things comes by. So the other thing that I think as the backbone organization is that along the way, as the collective gets known, there could be other opportunities out there. So there's a discipline for us to know when to sort of incorporate these resources that will make the collective work more impactful, and when to say no, so that you can keep really to the purpose of what the collective is trying to achieve. So the other function that I thought in Singapore that we can think about is really this ROI narrative. So what do I mean by a return of investment narrative? Here I thought about that we need to sort of have a concise story that sort of explain how the collective actually creates value for the individual partners and how it measurably improves the condition of the people that we want to help. This is very important because as individual organizations will be wondering why does it, some work, is it meaningful for us to come together? And if you are able to articulate the ROI narrative, right, it sort of help people to sort of understand why we are coming together. And I think when things get tough, be able to sort of hold the collective together. So the backbone organization probably will need to do the work of trying to gather the facts, the figures, trying to convert them into stories that the partners can use in presentations, in digital media. And this narrative really will be able to provide sort of a timeline to sort of be able to talk about the collective's value, and such that in a way that you can sort of let people understand why you're doing this within each other as well as in the larger community. So the other thing I feel that is that when you work in a partnership space like a collective, it can be especially tricky because they ask us to create and maintain dual loyalties. What I mean by that is that we sort of need to stay loyal to our home organization, at the same time having the additional loyalty to the collective. This is not only complicated, sometimes it can also lead to conflict when the needs of the home organization comes up against of the needs of the collective, and how do you then manage it? So from what I've heard from the various leaders is that I feel that collectives are really made, they are not born. So it really takes a lot of work, especially in a collective where the individual participants from the different organizations, sometimes due to manpower changes, can come and go. So as a backbone, then we need to learn how to guide our members, to learn how to put their issues on the table, and sort of to use straight talk, meaning to be able to speak politely but directly about the issues. And then we need to be able to navigate when we need to have smaller conversations, at the same time then moving to the larger conversations in the bigger group necessarily. So the backbone organization's role is not just about looking at the outcomes, but also enabling the members to be able to work actively on the partnership level, improving the ways that we work together. And I really think that this is one very key intangible value of doing collective impact work. And this is very distinguished from the regular partnership or collaboration where we are just looking to come together to solve a common problem or advance a people's issue. So this is really a very big takeaway from many of us who have just started doing this work. And coming to the fourth point is that many people think that the typical norm for decision making in a collective, which very much like a multi-stakeholder collaboration, that all decisions require consensus or unanimity. I don't think so. So collaboration does not necessarily mean consensus. Effective collective, right, have very efficient decision making process, and we need to have strong leadership. So not every collective needs to have elaborate documents of behavior or cultures, but we do need to have a set of established decision-making norms. Then that will really help us to result in the creation of decision-making practices. So say, for example, if we need to sort of land on certain key decisions to move the programs forward, if we are facing a funding deficit, how do we sort of come to a decision point of how things are done? And it's not really just going around the table to seek consensus, but to think about how we can make the decision so that we are effective, and also being able to sort of account to each other in terms of the work that we wanted to do. So last but not least, this is something that I feel that is very important as an add-on, really, that we take an assets-based approach, meaning to involve the target participants as much as possible, and being very creative about bringing these target participants onto the table. So for the Singapore Youth Impact Collective, we really considered wanting to have the youth being on the steering committee, but we know that it's a little bit difficult. So what we have done then is really for the various charity partners to sort of go out and have conversations, so to represent us, to talk to the target participants, to get their inputs and all that. And as a proxy to having their representation, we then invite the tertiary institution to represent them. And in doing so, we were also very intentional in the identification as well as selection of the particular staff member to join the collective, because we wanted as much as possible to have a authentic representation of the voice as a proxy if we are unable to have them there on the table itself. So this is really important because it does have an impact on how you look into the program development as well as the outcome that you want to achieve eventually. So these are some of the common reflections that each of us have, and I've aggregated them together as a thought process or a practice that you may want to consider as you sort of want to embark on being a backbone organization. The first and foremost is that I think collective impact work can face a host of many challenges, because all of us who are involved in this work, we don't quite work for each other, and actually, honestly, under no obligation to cooperate. So we sort of volunteer our time, our talent, our treasure to come together. And while we may be very altruistic in this desire, over time, as work comes along, it's very hard for us to hold on. So one of the things that we really have to focus on is the relational shipbuilding, and the backbone organization does play a role in that, to build trust between partners to the larger community, and also ensuring some form of psychological safety when we are having conversations within the smaller groups, as well as the bigger groups, where we want to sort of think through how things are done and being respectful towards each other's expertise areas and the resources that we could bring to the table. So one of the other key reflection that we have, which I wanted to touch a bit more, is about the presence of the role of the executive leadership versus support staff. Liz have really mentioned something about this, and I think this is a very crucial point to take into consideration, especially if you are a leader here and wanting to sort of convene and start. I think one of the biggest learning point for me is that as much as I wanting to do this, I must be able to dedicate a good amount of my time and knowledge to do this, so that we could sort of get the work going. And we need to be able to know when is the right time for the leadership to step up and play a greater role, as compared to putting the work down to the support staff. So for me, in the beginning, when we first started the SYIC, I think I spent quite a bit more time really trying to get to know the networks. And because we are leaders ourselves and we have certain authority to represent our organizations, we have the mind space and the bandwidth to know what are some of the things that we could push, what are some of the things that we could adjust within our organizational agenda in order to work within the collective. And I think this kind of knowledge may not be so accessible to the support staff. So as a leader in this, we need to understand the role and the scope that we play versus the support staff who may be out there carrying the work. The next point is really about being very aware about the evolving group dynamics and power dynamics as the collective evolve over time. So I feel that the group dynamics and all that is different when we first started convening it and bringing people together. As we maintain and run the collective, when we are doing the work, and then maybe when you're transiting to the end. So you need to have that awareness and be able to read maybe body language or sense things are not going on, and then to pick up conversations when this happens and how to resolve it. Because what you do not want is resentment to build up within the collective, and then murmurings within the smaller working groups that's outside there. And then that really will have an impact on how the collective actually function. So the other thing is really to be intentional, and we don't leave anything to chance. By that, what we are trying to say is that for every big group convening that we do, we actually have I think I spent like quite a few hours really just working towards organizing such meetings. So meetings are always planned. We don't come to the table without knowing where we are doing and what we are doing. So nothing is really left to chance. There is the pre meetings that we do to ensure that we hear from other people. We are aligned before we come to a bigger group gathering. So this is a role that the backbone really have to be very aware of, and to be able to have the time and resources to do this. The fifth point is really about being familiar with the local culture. And by the local culture, I don't quite mean the Singapore culture, but the local culture that you sort of work within the space that you are in, to know when and how you can navigate across different sort of stakeholder space between, I think, the language and the way we work at government agencies in the nonprofit space, at the recipient level is all quite different. So you need to be very familiar with sort of the broader local culture that you have, so that you can navigate along the different stakeholders when you sort of need to have conversations and to be able to sort of do the work there. And this is really important, especially when at some point along the way in the collective, there will be conflicts and disagreements. Then how do you actually manage the conversations around that? And last but not least, everybody gave the feedback. I mean, it was one of the most fun thing I've done in a long time, really, because when I speak to all the various leaders doing this, everybody, while we describe the challenges and the issues that we face, I could still hear the sense of energy and sort of enthusiasm in this. So the conclusion is that, yes, being the backbone organization doing this work can be quite difficult, but it's really worth doing it if we have done it right. And I do think that it's quite a satisfying role that we could play doing this work. And so that we have time for Q&A, I've also sort of worked out some sort of wish list that a few of us have come through when we were discussing this. Really, the value of starting a community of practice for backbone organization. And this is an experience that CFS has learned, because when we first started, we actually have the benefit of learning from two other backbone organizations, because we knew nothing much then. So we were the baby of the group, and the other two organizations were very generous in their sharing and learning, teaching us things that helped us to avoid some of the pitfalls. So I thought that if we could develop a community of practice for backbone organizations would be great. Some of things will be important to consider will be knowing what are the key competencies needed for staff to do the backbone work. This is the couple of us, I think we have sort of learned things along the way, and there are really some hard skills or technical skills that we could have picked on that will really make the backbone work much more smoother, I suppose, and knowing what are the competencies, and then being able to have practice-based training to sort of learn these skills will be very, very helpful to make the backbone work more sort of accessible and easier for people who wants to start this. And I think the fourth part is really about an idea that as a collective transit over time, there are different stages, and if it's possibility to have clinics for running these different stages for yourselves and also for us to learn from each other. And I saw on this sort of deck that there's this thing about getting a Tamarack coach to sort of guide you and mentor you. I think that will be something that maybe we can sort of, if you are really serious about doing this, and maybe the collective that you're thinking of is of a very thorny issue, having a coach or a mentor to guide you in the backbone work may be able to help us to do this more effectively. So I end off on this because I think that this really sums up the role of the backbone organization, and also to manage our own expectations being a backbone function. So as humans, we have a natural need for recognition and also wanting to be appreciated. But it's important to note that while the backbone of organization may be perceived as a position with the most power in the collective impact effort, I think sometimes we really have to think about the principles of servant leadership. So in essence, the backbone needs to play a very quiet behind the scenes role. We lift people up who are doing the work so that they get the well-deserved credit for the data-driven work that they are doing to support the beneficiaries. And in the end, we have to consider that we really could be an entity who is willing to take on this servant-oriented stance. So instead of being more visible, we will be able to play our role more effectively as with the partners across the sectors, such that they will feel respected and appreciated for the contributions that they have made towards the collective vision. So in doing the work of a backbone, sometimes we may not get a lot of thanks along the way, both at the organizational level across different partners as well as the personal level. But I think you will do get the kind of satisfaction when you see the change starts to happen and the kind of difference that it makes in the work that you see moving forward. So this is something that I thought to leave with you so that as we talk about the backbone organization, you can sort of reflect and think if you are ready, what are the skill sets is suitable for you to take this forward. And yep, that's really all I have. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Joyce. That was a very insightful sharing based on your personal experience, and also you have gathered inputs from other leaders who are involved in collective impact projects. So we are now going into the Q&A segment, but before that, I just want to send an apology on behalf of Paul because he is currently recovering from a surgery, so he will not be able to join us today. But I think we have Liz and Joyce who are with us, and I think more importantly are the questions that you are putting up for the answers. So do keep those questions coming so that we can really address the call of the concerns that you have with regard to starting a collective impact and maintaining it. So I'll now jump right into the question and answers because we don't have a lot of time. So my first question actually is to Joyce. It's really to put things into perspective because this seems to be a lot of work, right? And a lot of it is coordination and administration. So is it worth it, right? So my question to you is, to give a fair assessment to the Singapore Youth Impact Collective, what do you think has the collective achieved that would likely not be possible if each of the members were to continue delivering their services on their own?
So this is my own reflection and just hearing from some of the members in my collective. I think the biggest shift we have is the mindset as well as the way that we think about doing this work. And I find that very critical because CFS also work with donors and with the funders. We have a certain thinking around the funder-grantee relationship and how things are like and how we sort of want to get things going. And I feel that across the 2 years that we are doing this, I have seen changes in between the funders as well as the charity partners that we work with on how we work together to address a social issue. So to me, the mindset shift in coming together is very important because it really influences then each of us as we go back to our respective organization as a grantee, as a grantor or a funder, how I want to sort of operate and work with my other grantee partners as well as within my own organization. And similarly, I think for the charity partners to be able to see how do we work with funders quite differently. And I find that very empowering from the charity's point of view, really to be able to sit on the table to discuss issues as an equal partner. And I think that the value of the work of us coming together is much bigger than that. So I feel that if I were to have fund the various initiatives individually, right, there's no cross-learning of what's working, what's not working and all that. So being that collective, it gave us that natural setting for people to talk about it. So that's one. And the last other thing is really the resources at hand. So we typically think that funders are here to really just provide the monetary support. But in the collective, right, when we needed other non-cash resources, especially networks. So one of the areas that we had to do was really to find employment opportunities for our youth. And I think within the charity space was very hard to do so. So we were able to tap on the network, the influencers out there for us to reach out to other employers that we could not have done so if we didn't have the collective sort of resources come together and say, okay, you need this, let's see where I can find. And it's not just the organization, but also the individual network and resources that we have. So I feel that the collective really does bring a lot of value to the work for the issue at hand that we are trying to address, as also individually, organizationally, that we work within.
Thank you very much, Joyce. That gives us a sense of the impact that would otherwise not be achieved if individual agency were to work on their own, right? So coming together with the network and resources. I have a question for Lise, and I would like to invite you to go deeper into this process of setting up this leadership table and the action teams. Maybe from the perspective of someone who is going to start a collective impact, how do we go about looking for a convener? I think you touch on some of that, but give us a process view, like a video. You know, how does it happen? And when does the leadership team gets formed? Is it before the collective sets the shared agenda, or after? All right. So this related questions from some of the participants.
It's probably not one way for every community, but typically there are a group of people that say, hey, like the Community Foundation of Singapore, hey, let's do something in the area of better outcomes for youth or supporting seniors. And so they might begin talking to a few partners in the community and say, hey, we want to work on this issue. Are you also interested? So they might test the idea first with some trusted partners. And then they would, typically say, hey, we're thinking about a collective impact approach. What do you think? So that's how collective impact efforts often start, our conversations between a small set of partners about the issue, having a bunch of those conversations. And then typically one of those organizations invites a bunch of other people to a meeting to get some more feedback around that issue. So it's usually start small, they build out, they do a larger testing within the community, and the community says, yes, this is something that we think is important as well. And then they go to form a leadership table, right? So that's typically the way things go. That leadership table then takes the responsibility in the short term of building at least the initial framing of the common agenda. So they'll have a conversation around the leadership table. So for example, if they're working in the area of youth, they're going to have a conversation around the leadership table. What's the data tell us about youth in our community? Why do we think this is a problem or an opportunity? And what might we do together? So then they might form some initial thinking about what that might look like. Frame it loosely as a common agenda, but then what's really important is to take that out to a broader community and test it with a broader community of key stakeholders. And so that's generally how we see collective impact initiatives evolve. Starts with a small group of people. They test, the idea of let's do some work collectively around youth or whatever the topic might be. They all agree. Then they talk about who could we invite to a leadership table. There's a process of invitation around this leadership table. That group then is assigned with the initial forming or framing of the common agenda. And then they take it back out to the community to get community buy-in or to get the community's advice about what that might look like. So that's and that can take, depending on communities, that can take anywhere from 6 months to a year, that process, right? So it's not a fast process. It's not like all of a sudden tomorrow you're going to have your collective impact initiative. It really depends on, have there been already pre-existing conversations in the community about this issue? Are there people that are willing to step up to the leadership table? Is there a strong convener? All of those critical ingredients are important. And then the work around framing the common agenda, because even though I'm sure, Joyce, even though you had lots of people that were interested in working towards better outcomes for youth, they brought in different perspectives, right? And so you had to get agreement around
Yes.
what that actually would be, right? And how you
Yes.
would work together. And that takes some time to have those conversations. And so, you got to build in the time for that as well.
Right. Thank you, Lisa. I think that gives us some clarity in terms of the process. I have a follow-up question to you, and perhaps Joyce can chip in. Do you think, 6 months to 1 year of work for charities who are already, having their core work to do this of kind of exploratory work, it seems like a lot of resources, and then they may face resistance from management to want to commit to something like this. It's very exploratory, and there's no a sense of resourcing of this kind of work. Do you think if a funder were to do a grant call, for example, to say, I'm going to invest, let's say, 500,000 over the next 2 years to start a collective in this particular issue, do you think this will short circuit the process, or actually it will undermine this process of forming the collective? What's your view?
So my answer would be it would depend, right? Because in some cases that resource might help it really advance quickly because there's already readiness. So one of the big things in collective impact work is the readiness of the community to respond to the issue or to the opportunity. So if you already have a community that has they've been working collaboratively, there is a catalytic kind of organization that's willing to be a convener. There is, intention of your partners and some experience of being working together already. You actually can move that process forward a lot quicker. If you don't have that, you're going to have to work on that, right? And so I think it really depends on, the readiness of the community, and you can't underestimate that. Because you wouldn't want to, if there has no pre-existing collaboration, you wouldn't want them to take on collective impact. That's a bridge too far. So you might invest in them working collaboratively together first, get some of that under their belt, and then think about collective impact. So they could still work collaboratively together and get some project work done, and learn about each other as partners, build some trust, do all of that kind of stuff, and that money would still have good outcomes, but it wouldn't be necessarily collective impact work. But for communities that already have some existing collaborative work, have a good group like a community foundation, or someone stepping up to the plate to convene, having some resources will really move them quickly through that kind of first period of time.
Thank you, Liz.
What do you think, Joyce?
Yeah.
Actually, I totally agree with what Liz has said. It's about the issue and the readiness of the partners around that particular issues, and them being used to working together. Because even if we are used to working together, you still need a fair bit of time to sort of iron out some of the, because right now you're not just doing, so for me, the difference between a collaboration and a collective impact work is that collaboration, you sort of still have your own organizational agenda, and you sort of try to see whether you could fit this together and get it done. But in a collective work, you sort of have to agree on something that you will work together of, and different parts of it, whatever that thing is. And to come to that agreement, it's not so straightforward, because we each represent an organization, and we have different lands or different service areas that we deliver it. So to be able to cross that and say that, okay, this is something that I can do, what about you can do this and all that, that's one part of it. The funding part would really help to address maybe I always feel that money lubricates the process, but it's not the be all and end all. So there are also other resources that the various partners are able to bring onto that. And I feel that the money sort of help to answer some of the base foundational work. And at the end of the day, you also want to still think about what are the other resources, expertise, skills that people can bring onto the table to address the issue at hand. I mean, no amount of money, if money can solve all this, right, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about collective impact now already. Money could have really brought all these things together. So really, I think there still needs a bit of time, and also for people to get together and understand each other, because we are all individuals. We're still working with different people at the heart of things. So we need to know who you are, what I am, so that we can sort of partner and do this work.
Right, thank you. So I gathered that it's all about readiness, whether an existing collaborative relationship already happened within that particular community. It could be within a locality or similar organization that have an interest in a particular social issues, that know each other. Perhaps that's the start of the conversation. All right, good, thanks. Well, we have quite a number of questions around this issue of dynamics, power dynamics, right? So I would like to pose these two questions to both of you. How to navigate power dynamic within a collective, right? Particularly when it seems like, you know, the policymakers and the funders may have sort of more power than other stakeholders in the collective. Maybe this is just an assumption, but maybe I'd like to hear from both of you.
Do you want to go first, Joyce?
No, I'm going to let you go first because this is a difficult question. And Rika, you can also jump in doing this work, you know. So you don't just ask us. I'm going to go back to you on it as well.
Yeah, I think you answered this question though, Joyce, in your presentation, if I heard you correctly, when you said that groups should frame their kind of values and principles early on. So the leadership table should identify, you know, what are the values that are important to us? And often what gets surfaced in that conversation might be a conversation about voice, right? How voices around the table will matter. And that's about power dynamics, right? So if we want to have, you know, equal voice, equal participation, how we make decisions, all of those things actually begin to address some of those power questions. And I think that the values and principles are really important in terms of how we're going to work together as a collective and what that looks like. There will, by virtue of, you know, whether we give power away or we take power, there's always that kind of dynamic that happens. And so, you know, we really want to think about, you know, what could we do to talk about, and I think I heard you say this as well, Joyce, how can we have these really good conversations when a question of power or a negative dynamic appears, right? How can we address it early on? How can we, you know, talk about how it might be having a negative effect on how we're working together as a team? And I think, you know, a lot of this is also really thinking about how we're building trust and connection amongst the partners around the table and our partners in the community that we're working with. And that, you know, that's that process stuff that we don't think takes a long time, but it actually takes longer. And if we don't pay attention to the process, we're going to just run into challenges all the time. And so you got to pay attention not only to the process of being together and working collectively, and also to the product of what you're trying to change in the community. And so it's that tension, right, of process and product.
From the SYSC experience, I think in the earlier when we first started doing this, I think for some of the partners that we have, they are not used to that because typically funders have a bigger say. And so as a backbone organization, you need to play a bit of a facilitator role, I suppose, when you have to do this. So what we sort of, I mean, you can sense from the bigger group conversations where you know that there are some tensions going on. And actually what we did is that we sort of have smaller conversations, really trying to understand their concerns and fear and finding ways to sort of bring it up to the leadership table where we need to. And I think in Singapore culture, okay, we are typically quite conflict avoidance, right? We don't like to disagree and shout at each other and things like that. So as a convener or playing this role, I really have to sort of know who having some issues, talking to them, assuring that things are okay, and then maybe going back to the other party, having conversations around. And that's really one of the softer side of the role that the backbone has to play. And I feel that generally people, when they disagree, it is not out of disrespect or whatever, but really the intent and the passion behind what they are trying to achieve. So if we can sort of unpack the emotions and get to the issue and talk around it, you do have better resolution. One of the things that we did in the collective at the beginning, the first two convening that we did, was really to lay down a charter, not a charter, like we sort of sumpah on the kind of behavior and practice that we want to have. So we had 2 sessions of those and laying it out, and we actually got every member to sign off it just as a pledge or as a promise, and we hold ourselves to it. And I think when there is a situation like this happening, you can bring it out. And over time, we do see the relationship evolve as sometimes you need a bit of this to sort of test each other out, right? And then you sort of move forward to it. So the role of the backbone does play a little bit in terms, because as the backbone, you sort of see the whole sort of schema of things, and then really, and I think myself, we have to take a very objective stand, and that's why I said right at the beginning, putting the purpose of the collective right in the center, the users right in the center, and from there having that conversation really helps. You have anything to share from experience? Not going to let you off on this.
I think both you and Liz have touched on the call. I also resonate with that, the importance of setting the principles and values up front. It could be in the form of the charter or terms of reference, but every member of the collective needs to agree and abide by that. And that sort of set up the structure and power distribution within the collective, whether you are a funder or you are a policymaker or you are a service provider. I think this is very important, particularly when the convener is a service provider. In a way, there could be some form of perceived conflict of interest. I think it is useful to have that kind of difficult conversation, to have it out front, so that everybody knows, where each other is coming from when we go into a difficult issue. All right. So that I hope that has answered the questions the participant have asked. So because of lack of time, I'm going to go into the last question, because I'm very amazed by what Joyce and Liz have shared about the constituents of this collective coming up with resources on their own to contribute to the collective. So even though for the Hamilton Poverty Reduction Project, the backbone function actually costs about 500,000, eventually to about $1 million, but actually it comprises of donation in kind, of secondment from members. So how did you arrive at that? How do you come to a point where actually members are committed enough to contribute resources to the collective? Maybe Liz first and then followed by Joyce, please.
Yes, so those members were members of the roundtable. They were part of the leadership table, and we asked them, we kind of identified what the piece of work was, and we asked them if they would be willing to contribute. And we had very few no's. People were willing to contribute or second people, or we didn't ask people things that we knew they couldn't contribute. We asked them what we thought they could contribute, and they were willing to step up to the plate. There's a really great tool that I use often with other collective impact initiatives that I work with. It's a tool from an organization called Liberating Structures, a website, and it's called the 15% Solution. And so it's really cool because you ask everybody around your leadership table, what's 5 to 15% that you're doing right now that you might be able to contribute to our shared goal, right? And I did this with a group in Oregon once, and it was a group that was working in early childhood education, and they were working collectively together. And one said, I could write about our collective work in my newsletter. The next person said, I could bring you to my class because I'm teaching early childhood educators and we could talk about our collective work. The third person said, oh, I'm meeting with the governor of the state next week. I could bring you along to that meeting and we could talk about our shared and collective work. And I think sometimes we sit around these tables and we show up, but nobody ever asks us what we can contribute. And so the 15% solution tool is a really great tool to ask people, what can you contribute that you're already doing? In another case, there was an example, they were hosting meetings across the province of Ontario, and one person said, I have a database of 700 people. I could send the invitation to the meeting to my database. So it wasn't a big thing, but it really helped get the message out. And so sometimes we kind of look inwardly and we think, oh, how do we do this on our own? And yet if we have, 20 people sitting around our leadership table or around our working groups, just imagine the resources that they have linked to them that you can kind of bring in to help advance the shared work. And I think, Joyce, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of things that are out there that, if we invite that in, people are willing to step up to the plate.
Thank you, Lise.
Yeah.
Joyce, what about you? Yes.
My simple mantra in life is just have to ask. At most they said no, and then you just ask again. So I think in our culture we sometimes don't quite, not very used to asking or and all that. And I feel that for the collective that we did, we have limited resources, right? So while CFS we fund ourselves for the backbone because we had a bit of a grant to do so. Then for the other resources like meeting spaces, getting facilitators and things like that, we sort of reach out and say, okay, we don't have quite the money for this. Can anyone help? And I think once you set that as a right at the beginning as part of the culture or the practice you have within the group, it sort of stays there, and after that, and as and when you need help, you just ask. And I feel that that's something that is really very, very simple. And I think then being on the collective, my mindset is also really that if I can help, I will do it. Whatever resources I have in terms of my own network, the influence, the partners that we know, we sort of put it out on the table. One of the things that I wanted to sort of add on as part of the earlier conversation is confidentiality. So I think I cannot undermine that. So if we are working with various organizations and they're very much willing to provide certain data and all that, especially with government agencies, we need to uphold that promise if we are working together, if we wanted to have a sense of where things are. Because I think one of the things that was very useful for us is really needing to see some trends and all that, and to be able to get that information and sort of holding that trust within the partners that we have was very important, and not sort of like, because there could be some considerations that they have that we may not be aware of, and being able to uphold that is important. So yeah, just coming back to this, then it's really a matter of asking. And also, I think at that point when we brought in the funders, we were also intentional that the funders were not just monetary resources. We also looked at their background and also the various partners that we have, the space that they are in, and how known they are, what kind of work that they have done, so that we know that it's actually much bigger than just individuals, organizations coming together.
Thank you, Joyce. So very quickly, we are come to the end of this webinar. When it is a good durian, I mean, I don't know whether Lise know about durian. When it's good durian, it seems like time is very short in finishing up the durian. So okay, so before we come to the end of this webinar, I just want to really appeal to the participants to fill up the survey feedback form for us, because your feedback in terms of the usefulness of the webinar is very important for us, and also letting us know what else do you want to find out at the next webinar, because the next webinar, which is going to happen on the, on the 25th of November, is going to be the last webinar of the series, and we are going to leave it free. We are not going to set a topic, but really to go into those topics that you are most concerned about, so that we can have more time to address them. So do let us know what you want us to discuss at the last webinar. And secondly, if you think that you have a community that's ready to embark on a collective, on a complex issue, please approach NCSS. You can write to me directly, we'll be able to share my email address with all of you. I'm interested to hear what collective that you want to start on what issue, so that NCSS can think about how to support you in that journey. So so do write to us. The second thing. Third is join us in the Gather Here online platform. This is hosted by SSI. The link will be sent to you at the end of this webinar. Please join us in this online platform, because we're going to share resources through that platform. All right. So that is a very quick 3 messages that I would like to give to you before I call this webinar to an end. And thank you very much for Lise and Joyce for providing such a good presentation, and for all of you spending your morning with us today in this. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again. All right. 25th of November, please mark down. Thank you.